Good morning, everyone. Good morning. A little loud. We're going to go ahead and get started. I understand there was a delay in the JR line this morning, so people may be a little bit behind and coming in, but I think we do need to go ahead and begin. So thank you so much for coming out to the first session of the day after our plenary, but the first technical session. Today we're going to be having a discussion, and we'll have some interaction about scenarios, disaster scenarios, imagining how natural hazard events and other types of events can affect the communities where we live and where we work, and what we can do to help increase resilience and to build, just help communities be able to face shocks in a better way. So I'm Janice Rogers from Geohazards International, and I have with me a wonderful panel that you'll get to meet in a few minutes. So today we're going to be talking about can seeing the future in the form of scenarios help us to mitigate risk. So we have an interactive component. We're going to be doing a Mentimeter poll. If you all want to go ahead and scan the QR code and get ready for that, we'll do that in a couple of minutes. There's also, the code is here as well and on the board in the back. So first of all, we'll just introduce our panel. I'll say a few things, and then we'll hear from our panelists, and then we'll have a discussion. And so we hope to hear from you. So before we start, I want to talk about what I mean by scenario. This is something that this term is used very differently by a lot of different types of professionals working in different ways. But how I'm going to be using this term today is a scenario is work that examines and depicts the impacts that a plausible but hypothetical hazard event would, or a sequence or another occurrence, maybe a pandemic, perhaps a climate impact, would inflict on people, the built and natural environments, and society. So today we're going to be talking about scenarios that not only describe that event, but also what happens. What happens to buildings, what happens to infrastructure, what happens to the land itself, and then the consequences for people and for society. A very simple example. This is a hospital in the Himalayas in Bhutan. What might happen if they have a particular earthquake? We looked at several earthquakes, but what might happen to the facility? And then what the impacts are on their ability to deliver medical care and serve the community. So this is a very simple example, but you can use scenarios in a lot of ways to help describe risk, describe consequences, and more importantly, what can we do to reduce those? So today I have a wonderful panel. We have Professor Norio Maki from Kyoto University, Dr. Helen Crowley from the Global Earthquake Model Foundation, Dr. Ramesh Gorgain from INSET, the National Society for Earthquake Technology in Nepal, Dr. Laurie Johnson of Laurie Johnson Consulting, Dr. Ann Wine from the US Geological Survey, and I'm Janice Rogers again. So these professionals have all used scenarios in different ways to help reduce risk and to build resilience. And now we are going to go to our poll. So we'd like to hear from you. So if we could switch over to the Mentimeter now. Okay, did everyone get the chance to get the QR code? No, okay, maybe we can switch back, sorry. We'll leave this up a second. Okay, does everyone have the QR code now? Almost. Okay, I hope it's working. Okay. Okay, so can you please raise your hand if you have ever developed a disaster scenario? Okay, several people. Oh, lots of people. Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, now, for which country did you prepare your scenario? Those of you who've developed a scenario before. Okay, let's see. Oh, we have the US, we have Canada, India, Nepal, New Zealand. Oh, okay. Like South Africa? So we have quite a lot of geographic diversity. People have been preparing scenarios all over the world: Africa, Asia, Pacific, South America, North America. Wonderful. Thank you. Let me see if we have any more. Okay. Well, let's go to the next question. So raise your hand if you've ever used a disaster scenario. Lots of you. Okay. Thank you. And then for what main purpose, if you've used a scenario before, for what purpose did you use it? I think you might have to pick one, and if you pick the main purpose. So I know many times we use scenarios for multiple things. We might use them for preparedness drills or exercises. We might use them for planning. We might use them to speak to the public. The example I gave from Bhutan, we use them to talk to doctors because they're used to the medical field and not thinking about earthquake damage in their buildings. All right, lots of disaster risk reduction planners, emergency response planners.
I'm curious who are the two that used it for recovery?
We have some recovery planners here, so yeah. The question is who's used scenarios for recovery? Well, public awareness, there we go. Okay, I think, has everyone had a chance to complete the poll if you would like to? Okay. All right, so we have a lot of planning, we have a lot of risk communication with partners, some recovery planning, a little bit of primarily public awareness. Okay, well, thank you all. If we could go back to the slides now. Okay. Let's see. Wrong thing. Okay, so thank you. And now we're going to hear from our panelists. So if we could call Professor Noriyomaki. You can take this mic, I think. We'll use this one from the podium. It's on.
Okay, good morning. This is Noriyomaki. I'm from Japan, so maybe I should start my presentation. And I would like to share with you about the Japanese experience of scenario-based data risk planning. And it starts from the before 1995. Today, next year would be the 30 years anniversary of Kobe earthquake. And before Kobe earthquake, we didn't have what we did is that we just put some big shaking place just under the knees of the cities, and we just did the scenario for the interplate one. But as you know, that the active fault line caused a huge devastating damage to the cities. Our government decided to check the active faults, and after that, we did that risk assessment based on a found active scenario. In Japan, we have, do you know when I started? In Japan, we have almost hundreds. Okay, 1 minute. And also, 1 minute, okay. And also, our central government developed such a nice mapping system. We can check that the possibility of each fault line-based scenario, and also we compile all those active faults and interpolate scenario. And now we are here. Now the place we are here is the high risk of the anyway, strong shaking. And this is what we did after Kobe earthquake. And now we're starting to do the new things for recovery planning. That is why how we did those scenarios is that mainly for public awareness, and also we use that for the response planning, but the use is very limited. And now we are working for the recovery planning, pre-disaster recovery planning, and to make a recovery planning, we need another scenario. And I'm afraid that I will not have enough time to explain that. But for example, one community which have a high risk of the tsunami, this is the map, This is the map for evacuation, and it's a worst case scenario. But now we develop another tsunami simulation, and this is more high possibilities and all the seawall working, so that now we do have another scenario, so that we should know that based on we should decide which scenario we use based on how we will use those scenarios, those simulations. This is the end of my place. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Maki. We're going to have an opportunity to ask questions, but at the end, so thank you. Next, if we could have Helen Crowley of Global Earthquake Model Foundation.
Okay, thank you. Get my slide. So I have 3 minutes as well to talk about GEM's experience with earthquake scenarios. So we use OpenQuake Engine, which is our open source software for running earthquake scenarios. So this is for ground shaking and ground failure and calculating the impacts of earthquakes. And we really accelerated our experience with scenarios and running scenarios for different users through a project called TREC, so Training and Communication for Earthquake Risk Assessment. And so this project, we were working in particular in cities in Ecuador, Dominican Republic, and Colombia. And we were working not just with researchers and academia and universities, but also with the municipalities from those 3 cities. And the first thing that we really did was to have workshops with the end users and stakeholders of those scenarios and to discuss with them what were the scenarios that were going to be considered. Were we going to repeat a past historical event? Were we going to consider a fault that's close to the city? And to really design with them, co-develop those scenarios with them. Also, what were the needs in terms of the outputs? Often there were requests for things like numbers of trucks, numbers of tents, food and water, but we realized quite quickly that our models, which are really based on the buildings and the people in the buildings, and those metrics on the collapsed buildings and the displaced people was really what we needed to start with. And then from there, those other metrics could then be calculated by the different users. So here's an example for one of the scenario profiles that we produced. This is just for one of the cities in Cali in Colombia. So apologies, it's in Spanish. Those of you know Spanish will be able to read it. But what we're seeing, so it's changing here from different scenarios that were considered. We're seeing different columns there showing the different areas of the city and ranking them in order of the values from the scenario. So we have number of collapsed buildings, number of fatalities, injured people, displaced people, and so on. And so then that's a ranking. And at the bottom there, we're also showing the global results for the whole city, and also an indication of uncertainties. So here we're showing also the uncertainties in those metrics. We've continued work now in another project, FORCE, which is both of these projects have been funded by USAID. In the FORCE project, we're also working in Bhutan, in Nepal, and in El Salvador. This is just an example of some work we're doing in the project to also look at forecasting exposure, forecasting the built environment in the future. How many people, how many buildings, what will the vulnerability of those buildings be in the future, so we can also run future scenarios like what if in 30 years an event would happen. Also in Bangladesh, we have a project here funded by UNDRR, working with the Ministry of Disaster Management and Relief. and a number of other universities and academic institutions. And here the needs really came for us to go beyond ground shaking and to consider secondary hazards. So here we were considering liquefaction in particular, and also bringing in not just buildings, but road networks and transportation networks and the impact of liquefaction on those networks. Just a final comment on some of the challenges. So we're presenting often to audience that are not technical, and so we have realized through this work that we need to also train through producing a number of training materials on what are earthquakes, what are the impacts of earthquakes, what do those scenario profiles mean before we even look at the results of the scenarios. So that's really one of the challenges, and I have some thoughts about the future, but I think we'll save those probably for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Next, we're going to hear from Nepal, Dr. Ramesh.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'm Ramesh Guragai from Nepal, and we have experience of developing scenarios in several cities in Nepal, Pakistan, Bangladesh, several countries. And I'm sharing 3 of our lessons. We have several, but 3 minutes, 3 lessons. The number 1 lesson for us, through different projects and programs that we have learned, is it's very important to change the scientific loss estimation results to the people to understand. So this is an example that we had, they calculated the potential damage to the water supply pipelines from earthquake. It came off like, the 1,200 breaks to the pipeline with more than 4-inch diameter. When we share that information, even for the planners and decision makers, it's difficult to understand. But when we translated that to the potential functionality and the impact that we are not getting water for, the 6 months to this area. And then, after 1 week scenario, even after a week, you see this is Kathmandu Valley and all these, the central part is the mostly urbanized area. And we don't get water there. It's very simple and easy to understand by people, even the decision makers and the planners. So this conversion of the scientific information to the language that people understand is very important. This is for the planning purpose. So the demystification of the science and technology is, I think, very important. That's number 1 lessons while we develop the scenario. Similar lessons is for people, even it's related to more for the public awareness, that further translation of those even informations to to a comic book for students. We have a typical character, Kathmandu character, the typical the person and the family. We have the Bhaija, that's a typical character, the clerk, at the office. What happens to his family just after earthquake, 1 week after the earthquake, and then 1 month after the earthquake, 6 months, even a year. So we have a whole book of stories based on those scientific calculations. And then when people read it, then they can link to their own families and the friends and others, and then how the support came. And we had this scenario together with the Geohazard International, Janice's office, and then with USAID support quite long back. And we revised that after 2015 earthquake because the context changed, the potential, the support may change, and then the risk also changed. So we have this. So this story from the scenario is very important also for the wider communications and to understand by people. So that's the second lesson that we have. The third one is more recent. We are a part of Tomorrow Cities, the project that we have been implementing in several cities and countries. It was, the rigorous 5 years research, and now we are in the process of implementation. We have a whole session tomorrow whole day, so please come to the small hall there. But one of the aspect that I would like to bring here is the future exposures that Helen talked a little bit with the GEM ports. But in our case, at the city level, it's more of the quite detailed, the future exposure, the particular location, type of the buildings, the individuals, their education, economic, cultural, several aspects, so that the mayors of the city can decide properly now, not only based on whatever we have, but also whatever we may have in a particular area. So the right side is a Kokana in one of the area in Kathmandu, and we have such a detailed future exposures planning, and there can be several possibilities. That's just one example, and then they can check, which one to choose. So this is another third lessons for us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ramesh. Anne, we'll now hear from Dr. Anne Wine of the U.S. Geological Survey.
Hello. The United States Geological Survey has co-produced for 17 years multi-hazard scenarios, and these are the shakeout scenario, which became an international shakeout drill. Maybe it's in your country. A series of atmospheric river storms in the winter, based on a past historical event, but more likely to happen in the future. A long-distance tsunami with rupture characteristics like the Tohoku Oki earthquake, and finally an earthquake sequence, and that is learning about the aftershock sequence that happened in Canterbury, New Zealand. So most recently, this haywire scenario was published in 3 volumes of earthquake hazards and engineering implications and societal consequences. So the scenario earthquake sequence, I think it's one of the first scenarios to have really evaluate through a whole sequence over a few years. Our objectives were to communicate about earthquake hazards and inform about risk reduction and support response and recovery planning. Hundreds of researchers and practitioners built the building here of the scenario, and each story is the earthquake hazards and the engineering impacts and the societal consequences. On the 3rd floor, the community at risk, you can see that box there, and our next speaker, Laurie, is going to elaborate on deeper analysis that occurred there. So this scenario was wired, as in that's why haywired, to test our strength and our connectedness. The technical and peer-reviewed reports in the 3 volumes were distilled into story maps, fact sheets, a movie, and an exercise toolkit. The movie is widely watched and used in community meetings. The toolkit breaks down the scenario into discussion-based exercises immediately, so people can immediately start exercising and thinking about their organisation with references back to the scenario, but does not require reading thousands of pages. And another successful product was up in the top right there, liquefaction and sea level rise, and this came out of questions our engagement partners were asking. What about that interaction between sea level rise, raising the groundwater, increasing the probability of liquefaction? And that got like 400,000 hits in its first year. Throughout, we've held a lot of workshops with lifeline operators and fire chiefs, telecommunications industry, economic and business, regional economists and businesses. But we had 2 major events. There was Outsmart Disaster that rolled out all the hazards and the engineering aspects. And then we had the Haywired Connection, which was really focused on all our societal analyses and collaborations. And these 2 events relied on consortia who helped us run the meetings, facilitate them, and bring them to the people. And that was Pierre there in the joint venture Silicon Valley. So just in closing, there's a few things that I've learned about making co-producing scenarios. One is having that geographic GIS hub for all the data, so you can integrate across the hazards, across all the engineering results, and with all the societal data. I really think it's important to value and respect our partners for whatever they may bring to the table. Our Lifeline analysis was very varied in contribution from the Lifeline operators, but you can still bring it all together. And to be very flexible in your process, because it's a lot of connections of one thing leading into another, and invariably there are delays, and so having sort of backup ways of doing things and readjusting is important, and also involving trusted messages. So the regional economists are already got their networks of people that trust them with the message, so having them helping us with the analysis and creating what the messages were, I think is very effective. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Now we'll hear from Dr. Laurie Johnson.
Thanks, Janice, and good morning. Oops. So I'm just going to continue on with the work that I did in the Haywired scenario. And just as a little background, I worked on all of the scenarios that Anne mentioned. My work had largely been policy related, looking at the implications of these scenarios from a number of perspectives for the response planning, recovery planning, and resilience planning, and preparedness. What I was really interested in doing with Haywired, and Anne and the team at USGS accepted it, was that I really felt we wanted to push the envelope a little bit and look at long-term recovery and what the implications of a complex scenario like this was for recovery planning and policy in the San Francisco Bay Area, an area I live in, I know well, and I know the planning community really well. So one of the first challenges is that typically when we build these scenarios, the tools that we use have limitations. And so one big limitation we had was that HAZUS is the loss estimation tool that FEMA developed, is the main tool that we use for the calculations of damage. But we did a number of other damage calculations outside of HAZUS. So we needed a way to integrate those together so that we had a real picture of building damage and displacement and damage levels. That really was the underpinning of me deciding and working with Anne to come up with the definition of communities at risk. And what we meant that they're places where community functions will be severely impaired or cease to exist for months, even years. For me, this was like my work in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, or even the blighted neighborhoods in Northridge that we began to call ghost towns after the 1994 earthquake in Los Angeles. Where residents may be forcibly displaced because of direct damage to their homes and neighborhoods, or voluntarily relocate because there are waves of displacement after large and densely damaging events like this, because they cannot contain services or otherwise recover. So it was a three-part methodology that we developed. The first is, where are those communities at risk once we integrate all that damage data together? Who lives in those communities at risk so that we could really understand the displacement risk, and what are the long-term recovery implications. So just quickly to talk about this, once we integrated in all the different types of damage, we looked at areas where there was concentrated building damage. I interviewed a panel of experts who work on housing and population displacement after disasters. There is no defined level at which an area becomes at risk of additional voluntary displacement because of the direct damages. But we decided very conservatively, everyone thinks the number is even higher than this, but we said any place with a US Census tract where 20% or more of the building damage was in a complete or severe damage state, extensive damage state, meaning in our terms in the United States, the building was yellow or red tagged. So that would lead to additional seepages and waves of displacement from people around that as well. So that actually brought the numbers up for Haywired a lot. Damage to nearly 1 million residential buildings, which is 1.4 million housing units, or a third of our regional housing stock. And nearly 50% of all those uninhabitable or completely destroyed housing was in these areas of concentrated damage. So the damage was concentrated in the concentrated damage areas. And then we looked at who lived in those areas, and what we found was that actually in the multifamily, where we had the areas of concentrated multifamily damage, we actually had a huge portion of the Bay Area's population. So our most vulnerable multifamily housing also had the highest numbers of people were in those areas. So as many as 1.4 million people live in those areas where 20% or more of the multifamily building damage was extensive or complete. And we also looked at their vulnerability indicators and found that there were 340,000 people in these areas of concentrated damage that had 5 or more of the 10 community vulnerability indicators. So really underscoring that displacement risk was very high in these areas because of the vulnerability also associated with the people living in these areas. We also developed indicator sets for young and mobile populations, assuming that if children don't have schools, ties to the community, that they're going to want to move as well. And then lastly, what we did was actually put together a typology, and this for me was really to begin to help planners understand where areas of concentrated damage are and are likely to be the communities at risk. So these are areas with substantial land damage, building or infrastructure damage caused by liquefaction or landslides, areas with surface fault rupture, including afterslip, areas with the concentrated building damage from ground shaking and fire, and areas with substantial infrastructure and transportation damage. And then out of that was actually a set of policy recommendations that we've continued to advocate for in the Bay Area. Thank you. Sorry, I ran over.
And now I want to share a very brief overview of some research that we have been doing to take all of the lessons from many of the scenarios that you just heard about and many others around the world. And then now we're going to start talking about the future. How do we take scenarios into the future? So at Geohazards International, after doing a number of scenarios, including the one that Ramesh mentioned, we started thinking about, well, how can we make these better? How can we make them more effective? How can we use them to mitigate risk? Not necessarily preparedness exercises or recovery planning, but we're interested in pre-disaster mitigation at Geohazards International. So we looked at what's been done, and then we developed some practice advances on how can we make scenarios more effective, again, focused on mitigation. And now we're about to be applying those in a follow-on project, and this is supported by the U.S. Agency for International Development, and also some of the formative research was supported by the U.S. Geological Survey. So what did we do? We interviewed people in 4 locations: California, Nepal, Ecuador, New Zealand. We are looking, by the way, at geologic hazards. You hear a lot about earthquakes today. That's because earthquakes are rare in any one place. And it's hard for people in the community, if they haven't experienced it, to imagine what might happen. So we use it really as a risk communication tool. So we looked at a lot of scenarios worldwide. These are what was available in the various places where we were doing interviews, a large body of knowledge in various places. What did we learn? First of all, very important, the development process in creating a scenario. People getting together, having conversations, that co-production element with stakeholders was especially essential. The scenario itself had to be scientifically and technically credible, of course, and realistic and plausible. The outputs had to be practical, communicated clearly, and have some specific recommendations so that people knew how to take things forward. And that's really where the work starts, is taking it forward after you have your results. So we wrote some guidance, and you all might have received a card when you came in. This has got the same QR code and to get our guidance on how we make scenarios more effective for mitigation. This is for people who both develop and use scenarios who might participate in the process. It was generated for geologic hazards, but it's broadly applicable. The principles are to both hydromet disasters and climate hazards. And there are different parts that you might only need to look at a couple of these chapters. It's meant to be a very flexible tool if you are working on scenarios or you would like to. So with that, I think we can thank you all very much for listening to our introduction. I would like to take a couple of questions from the audience on the presentations, and then we'll have our panel. If our panel could go ahead and come up. Yes, in the back. Okay. Yeah, John?
Can I ask a question of the panel?
Of course.
Oh, okay.
Yes, on any, you may
So-
ask a question on any of the presentations.
Okay, so I really appreciated the presentations, really demonstrating how important the scenarios can be. My question is around how important you would see uncertainty in. I saw, you see a lot of in a sense, to present the scenarios to the public, you need to make it simple. You need to make it, or to whatever audience, you need to make it clear, and that's part of the objective, is to take the complexity out of the analysis and make it simplified so that people can actually visualize it. But at the same time, the uncertainty in those numbers is extremely important in how one would ultimately use it. So, and I was thinking, Lori, in your presentation about presenting numbers of homeless, numbers of damaged buildings, we know as scientists and engineers that these are hugely uncertain estimates. So maybe you could comment on that.
So in the analysis, we actually show the many different means that we came up with. So there were ranges, but there were means for all of these different things. So we looked at different concentrations of damage by occupancy type. And then all of the occupancy types combined, all of those had ranges. We are communicating the means, but the full table of ranges are in there for anybody who wants to dig deeper. But I agree with you, John. I think one of the big challenges is really not, I guess I would say from the beginning, all of the USGS projects assumed a plausible, realistic, but not extreme scenario. So we tried to mitigate just kind of overall the uncertainty with these scenarios by not picking an extreme scenario. The further you go on the curve, the higher the uncertainty gets. And I think that's how we always approached all of the analytics, at least in the community at risk, was where we felt uncomfortable, we backed off, we communicated means. The number USGS put out in the engineering implications of Haywired was 152,000 displaced households. And I really know in my heart of hearts that number is going to be much greater. And that's really what I set out to do, was to show that the vulnerability and the likely voluntary displacement that's going to go on is going to be much greater. And I wanted emergency managers to be preparing for that, because our emergency plans are preparing for about 100,000 households in the Bay Area being displaced. And I know it's going to be higher. So that's just my gut, my experience in this field, looking at recovery after disasters.
Okay, briefly, I have two comments. Yes, we simplify, but we also intensify, and we go much deeper than you could if you were doing a probabilistic analysis and running thousands of scenarios. The other thing is that we gave background, so we showed all the faults in the Bay Area, the probabilities of those faults rupturing, zoomed in on Haywired, we showed different ways that fault could rupture, and then the message was, for this scenario, this is all relevant to any outcomes of anything that happens in the Bay Area, and seems to go over okay.
Okay, we have time for one quick question here in the front.
Hello, thank you for your presentations. I'm really interested in how your scenarios are being applied or used, taken up by practitioners, by emergency managers, or whoever across the board.
Maybe Ramesh, if you can take that one.
Yeah, so, for many purposes, that's why the communications, they can come in. So, mostly earlier we use more even for the public awareness that this is the level of the consequences, and that comes the uncertainties also. It's matter of communication again. There are two parameters. One is making the small, medium, and large so that you have all the range. But at the same time, among the the scientific communities, it's more of the consensus if there is uncertainty. So if there is no consensus among the professionals, then there is a question. But if we have a wider discussions in the process, we can minimize. But for the use, we are using for three main purposes. The awareness, so that people are aware, so that they demand for the risk reduction and planning and others. The second is the preparedness planning and recovery planning for the existing risk. And then the third one is for the risk reduction, so that the planning aspects are considered, risk reduction policies, for example, building code implementations and others are considered. So this is how we are using it. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'm going to pose a question to the panel. but it's also a question for the audience. And so be thinking about your response. I'll give a chance for people to also answer this question in a minute, but we'd like our panelists to take maybe 1 minute since we don't have a lot of time. And the question is, what do you see as the future directions with scenarios and why? Maybe we could start and come this
Okay,
way.
so I didn't show in my slide, but that I'm very much interested about that how we can show the a possibility, uncertainty of the scenario. So I would now developing the scheme to evaluate or rating the scenario that the government shows, and that is another thing. And also we would like to make several scenarios corresponding to the purpose, how we use those simulations, like awareness raising or emergency response evacuation recovery. It will be different.
Yeah, for us, the future of scenarios, there are a couple of points. Number one, in the process, participatory, the multi-hazards, future-oriented, inclusive. I think these are the very important points now. Earlier, we developed, the landslide scenario, earthquake scenario, trying to combine now. Earlier, we developed and we communicated now co-productions and working together with the communities and the cities. And then not only for the existing, but the future exposures, and also, the future hazards considering the climate change. So these are, I think, the directions. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think I mentioned this yesterday as well, looking at different possible futures. So in addition to future exposure, but how might the vulnerability of buildings look if we look at different types of retrofitting, different implementations of building codes, different vulnerabilities, and showing what might the future be depending on what we do, and also looking at the costs of those and sort of cost benefit. But that would be my suggestion, is to really use these scenarios to show what the future might look like depending on what we do today.
My hopes are that we'll be pushing the envelope on the scenario development technology to make sure that we do integrate all the potential areas of damage and loss together more. So we need to work on our tools. And the second area that I'm excited about, because some GIM researchers and others have picked up the interest, which is really about doing displacement modeling. We just didn't have good, everything that we did was a very GIS intensive, thanks to the masterful geographic analysts at USGS. We did a very data intensive analysis, but Nicole Paul and others at Stanford as well are really moving the modeling forward in this area. So I'm excited about that, because I think that's really an essential next piece of scenario development, is to understand who gets impacted and how many people really are impacted.
Yeah, I really want to endorse what Ramesh said, your 3 points. And I've been interested in diversifying the engagement of our scenario. So there are hundreds and hundreds of people, researchers and practitioners involved in our effort, but we miss a lot of populations. And I experimented in a few collaborations with some diverse students with diverse backgrounds. And what I learned was, one is targeting the population, for example, minority small businesses or mutual aid operations. Another approach they took was taking a topic. So we have communities at risk, we have economic analysis, but the topic she took was food security. And just by gathering around that topic, then you bring in really purposeful, all kinds of people can participate. And it was a very nice example also with an anthropologist at a university who used a process where we're listening to the community first before even bringing Haywire into their attention. And a LGBTQ+ centre ended up not ever mentioning earthquakes at the beginning, but they ended up wanting to queerify disasters and prepare their centre for earthquakes because they had better understood what their vulnerabilities were.
Right. We've heard a lot of fantastic ideas for the futures of scenarios. One of the benefits of going last is everyone said pretty much everything I was going to say. I love that people are thinking about inclusion, thinking about multi-hazard approaches, thinking about taking things into the future. I think that's a real advance that we can make and scenarios have done some of this, but really bringing in some of the techniques for business strategy planning and helping expand people's perspectives and help with mitigation decision making across hazards. I think that's an exciting possibility for the future. And now we'd like to hear from you. Maybe we can have 3 or 4 people. What do you think, those of you that use scenarios or work with them or would like to, what do you think the future directions might be? Or perhaps also, what are the needs that you see? Anyone would like to go? Yes.
So we're from the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, and we have a couple of different approaches to scenarios that we're sort of developing and thinking about. One in particular is called a transformative scenario approach, and it starts from the socio-economic kind of future possibilities, and it maps out 4 different futures into the world. So rather than kind of diving straight into the kind of technical, scientific element of scenarios that, you know, we've kind of seen here, we get people to really imagine what these worlds look and feel like and sound like, because we know that the future isn't going to look and feel like what the world is that we live in today is. And then we overlay that kind of future kind of climate change projection into that world. And the purpose of this scenario in our field is, in the first instance, particularly for emergency agencies, to really stress test whether their plans and their strategies and their kind of resourcing and operational requirements will hold up in those future worlds with those natural hazards with the climate change overlay. So that's one approach that we're trialling at the moment, and we're getting a lot of really good traction with that.
Other thoughts?
I'm Olivia from the National University of Singapore. I was really excited about what Helen said about looking at trying to model the impact of interventions. Because what we find when we look at the individual level is that people's actions are driven more by their perceptions of the protective action than they are by their perceptions of the risk. So in many cases, the conversation, the most constructive conversation we can have is about retrofitting or raising building standards or applying building standards more consistently. And so if much of what you do is about communicating the risk, but being able to link that to communications about the intervention, I think would be sort of enormously promising and help to trigger some of that action that we all want to see.
Right. Does anyone else have something they'd like to share?
Thanks. Mark Pelling from UCL and the Tomorrow Cities project. We also have an approach a little bit like yours, where we start with normative visioning and then layer future hazards on that to understand what future risk might look like. But one of the challenges I think that we've surfaced in the work is both the advantage of GIS as a platform for holding data, which was mentioned, but also the limitations of that. Of course, there are many things that people would desire in the future that can't easily be represented in a GIS format. So we work quite hard to iterate between community actors and the GIS colleagues to find out what those residuals might be and how to bring them back in. So I wondered if there are reflections about the challenges of a GIS way of imagining futures in this way.
Does anyone want to take that question?
This reminds me about working with the anthropologist. So he came to USGS to give a talk, and he basically was saying, you know, the way you do your GIS analysis of populations is just not really explaining why people were there in the first place, and you know exactly how an anthropologist thinks. But what happened? So he took your approach of working with the community, and then we brought Laurie's analysis back in, and in the end, the two worked together. So a lot of the GIS analysis confirmed what people were saying, but they also elaborated because there's no transgender data in GIS, for example, which was of most important to that community.
Yeah, I would just add that I think when it comes to things like vulnerability indicators, that's where you're really on shaky ground. You know, I think we feel pretty comfortable to some extent with like mapping physical things. But once we get into the social things and we're using GIS to map social things, just like working with the LGBTQ community, that is not one of our 10 community vulnerability indicators in the Bay Area. We have age, we have household income, a number of other things, single households, but we don't actually have, people with, like sexual preferences or something like that, that actually is a discriminatory vulnerability indicator. Things like that aren't in our indicator set. So I think we're really missing, a huge amount of stuff, and that's where you get on shaky ground.
Okay, yes.
Just a quick example of application of scenarios in adaptation planning. We have used scenario planning for climate risk modeling and adaptation plan for island nations, where we had a full phase of doing technical work, developing the climate models and how it's going to affect people, infrastructure. And then we took it to the next phase where we're looking at sector-specific adaptation plans. And that's where I think showing, picking scenarios from event sets of, hurricane wind or sea level rise and explaining to the community how these could be really utilized for, future planning policy. I think that was a good application we thought for using scenarios. And that kind of honed in on some of the questions that were very important for the stakeholders to kind of decide and act on their future.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. I would like to now open it up for any further comments or questions to the panel on any of the presentations, on sharing your experiences, any of that. So please.
So I heard a lot of, quite a mixed group of ideas here this morning. There was some scenarios. There was loss estimates, there was risk assessment, and so on, whatever we want to call these things. And we know there's a lot of different ways of envisioning possible futures as consequences of different actions that we take today. So, you're saying like what would be useful advances? And I think certainly, better technology, better techniques would be useful advances. But I think it'd be really helpful to have some way of articulating the intentionality of this stuff. And I mean, it depends on the purpose and the audience. How does someone in this room, someone not in this room, know which approach and which way of doing that approach is going to be the best thing that's going to be best designed for their purpose? And we've had a lot of experience over the years, doing this in a lot of different places, in a lot of different ways, and it seems like that would be a useful contribution at this point.
Thank you. If I could just respond to that really quickly. The new guidance document that we developed has a chapter on setting objectives. It's working with your communities to figure out exactly those questions, because the scenarios are so flexible, to figure out what you want to do and why and how you might go about it. So there's some material in there that might be helpful in thinking those things through. So hopefully that'll be a resource for people. Are there other questions on anything for our panelists? We've got about 3 minutes left before the next session starts.
Janice, I wanted to offer something.
Absolutely.
Because back after the Northridge and Loma Prieta earthquakes in California, the company I work for, we also did research, and we wrote a National Science Foundation grant. We wanted to develop an exercise for local government officials to do, bring the public works director, the planning director, the economic person, the city official, manager and elected officials together, all these different disciplines, and have them focus on preparing to rebuild after a major earthquake. We were concerned about more earthquakes happening. And our premise was we didn't have the tools at that point in time to actually do a whole bunch of different scenarios for all these different cities. So we looked at the literature. As urban planners, we do scenarios all the time to sit down and do a land use plan for a city. I mean, doing the normative approach first is what urban planning does. And so we developed this exercise where we said, you tell us, you must pick an area that has heavy building damage. You must pick one of those, must be a residential area. One must be a commercial area. You must pick an area that has geologic hazard damage. You must pick an area with infrastructure damage. And then we took them through the tasks of doing damage assessment, developing policies for temporary uses, and then looking at areas that might not be, might need change as part of rebuilding. And we, you know, it was a National Science Foundation research study. Was that a plausible way to do a scenario and do an exercise to get the outcome we wanted, which was to help city officials begin to think about rebuilding after a disaster? And it was wildly successful. FEMA picked it up. They had training on this for years where they would send a whole city, you know, top staff to a FEMA institute to get this training. And it has, there is no GIS, there's no loss estimation software involved, and people can do this. People know their communities, and they can tell you where the vulnerable buildings are. They know where the infrastructure is already leaky. So it is not something that we have to have all of this sophistication in order to actually use the concept of scenarios. But I agree with Rob's point. It's knowing what your intended outcome is first, and then you can design, you know, a scenario event, exercise or game to achieve the outcome.
We have, I think we might have time for one question. 1 minute.
Thank you very much. I'm Sarah from United Cities and Local Government Barcelona. And I have a question on the loss estimation. Because when we look at the triggering it down into communities, the poor families, which Laurie referred to when you have to leave, they usually don't have never a bill on what they have lost, and they will spend 10 years to build their house again. And it's very similar to evictions, that if you don't calculate the cost of their working hours to build up their livelihoods and also the economic system, you don't have an argument to really calculate the cost. So if we now look into disaster, for example, I'm a German citizen, and there is exact numbers for every single piece you have lost in a disaster. So the disaster seems very, very expensive, while in Kathmandu the same disaster or a much bigger disaster had occurred, and of course the cost estimation is not there. So how can you, with your loss estimation, contribute that the non-insured livelihoods are also estimated in cost? Because I think we need these figures and numbers, and as more regions in the world will contribute, as more evidence we might have.
Yeah, just to bring we have the economic loss also calculated. And then, of course, the more risk-reduced scenario, larger infrastructures, more economic loss than the social or the casualty and others. And then, if it's a more vulnerable buildings and infrastructures, it's more of the casualty. Generally, in the poor communities, less economic loss. So there is again, it's plus and minus. If we see only from the economic perspective, it's a very low risk in that sense, but actually in terms of the potential casualty, there might be quite larger.
I think that's an important point. It's the amount might not be high, but it's very, very important for the people who are affected. It can be personally devastating. So I think this is a place maybe our tools maybe do need to improve in the future. So I think we are over time by a little bit, but please do come and discuss with our panel afterwards if you would like to, but please, we're going to conclude the session now. Thank you all very much for your participation and your questions.